Have you ever wondered how psychology, criminal justice, and communication dovetail together? Please come and join me as I speak to Professor Elizabeth Dose, Professor of Psychology at GHC. Welcome to the GHC Faculty Lounge. I'm Trevise Baldwin-Obas, and I'm here today with Professor Elizabeth Dose, who teaches psychology with Georgia Highlands College. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
I appreciate you taking the time to sit with us this afternoon. So, we have a lot of ground we want to cover. So let's start with the basics. Where are you from, and how did you end up at Georgia Highlands?
Originally from Chicago, moved to Central Florida for college, stayed in Central Florida, and I was a full-time psychologist, and I'll never forget, I was in session one day thinking, I can't do this. And I hadn't considered teaching up until that point. But I really enjoyed the psychoeducation portion of it. And I tried my practice on my family, and my family went deer in headlights look. So then I found a whole new audience in the classroom, and I started teaching at Daytona State. Taught there for about 15 years. And my family had a vacation home in Jasper, Georgia, and we loved it. And it got to the point where we were coming up so much, and I had gone around to the different colleges, and I found GHC, and I toured the campus, and I fell in love with it, and it was the only school that I applied to, and that's how I eventually ended here.
So how long have you been at Georgia Highlands now?
I've been here 10 years, and I love it. And
that is a milestone. A decade.
It's a decade. You as well. You as well.
Wonderful. So talk to us a little bit about what you do in the current classroom. So what kind of courses do you teach? What type of students are you teaching?
So I teach the traditional intro to psych, human development, abnormal psych. I've introduced forensic psychology, which is the criminal system and psychology. I've introduced careers in psychology. I'm hoping to institute an industrial occupational class and neuroscience, consciousness.
I think that would be well received.
I hope so. I've got some ideas in the works. So I've been teaching online, face-to-face.
And do you have a preference when it comes to your modality or anything like that?
I don't. I don't like to. I don't like to use lecture materials. I'd like to get in and just have broad discussions. And I'd like to hear what the students have to say.
Absolutely.
So I really believe that learning is reciprocal, and I learn just as much from them.
I was going to say, students really teach us. I mean, I know we are there to guide and help support and share our discipline, but I feel like you, I learned so much from our students. They are so bright, so eager to learn, and for me at least, it helps keep me going and interested in the field of education. So you mentioned a little bit that you had practiced a little bit in Chicago, I believe you said. Talk to us a little bit about that transition and how you're able to apply some of that to the classroom.
So clinically, I've been providing therapy since 1998. So the entire spectrum, from schizophrenia to children with behavioral disorders, autism, the gamut. About 15 years ago, I started with the Chicago law enforcement doing their officer-involved shootings. So I worked for an independent review board there and was brought in whenever an officer was involved in an unlawful shooting. That led to my work in Central Florida, working with homicide divisions, unusual cases. So in part of my practice, I go around and give presentations on interviewing psychotic suspects, or dealing with the mentally ill. And even now I'm consulted on cases where law enforcement runs into difficulties with a suspect engaging in odd eccentric behaviors.
So I'm sure in that kind of situation there are certain elements you have to be cognizant of, but then you also want to make sure you're preserving the rights of that person who's being interrogated or that particular suspect. How do you balance, when you're providing these training sessions, that information with the officers?
Very much so. It's difficult walking in not being a sworn-in officer because first impression with a psychologist is typically unnerving. But I think and just listening to me and listening to my case examples, they feel more comfortable. I think one of the things I've learned in working with law enforcement is that they tend to bring things home. So they're, everything, they might have a daughter with bipolar depression.
So they internalize
yes.
and process that.
So just building rapport, I think, is so key. But just to answer your question, that really helps me in the classroom. I could not walk into a classroom without these clinical experiences and be effective and really teach students the applicability of it. So,
and I'm sure your students love hearing those stories.
I think some of them, but there's some unusual cases.
Good. Yeah. And I like the fact that you mentioned that you have tried to take your experience and then bring those new course developments to the classroom. I think that's such an integral part of your job to be able to bring your strong points to the classroom. Have you had any students that you, over the last decade here, have been able to help move on to a next phase in their career?
It's that there's been so many students who have gone on for their master's and doctoral degrees in psychology, and it's humbling and just moving to see this. I had a generation of, I had the grandmother, the mother, and the daughter in my class. It shows you how long we've been teaching. But it's neat to see students go into the criminal justice field or neuroscience and then, come back and say that your class inspired me. And I know you have the same.
Absolutely. And with communication and psychology, a lot of the elements that we discuss really dovetail nicely. We look at behavior, we look at communication, we process nonverbal. And I love hearing the students that have had both us for communication psychology classes talk about the things that they've learned and how they correlate with their studies. So in addition to the teaching, I know that you are very active on campus. What are the types of programs, clubs, or organizations that you're part of that you're passionate about?
So another professor and I started Safe Zone, which is an LGBT plus organization to train students and faculty and staff on campus to be allies for that population. That kind of led into becoming trained in QPR, which is suicide prevention. So every semester now I do a suicide prevention workshop. We're currently working on a post-vention plan for students. The psychology club I started about 10 years ago. I love it. It's my absolute joy. Right now we've got between 35 and 50 members.
Amazing.
We have 25 members come out for the meetings. If there was one objective that I brought to the campus, it's really to get students involved. So it's not necessarily just on campus, but we take tours. So we go to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation every semester. We go to Hayes State Prison. In fact, we were the first academic tour that they provided.
Really?
So we were walked through the campus with the warden. We do Floyd County Prison. We've done the prison out in Atlanta. So it's really to bring in the criminal justice students as well. We did the NICU, the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit at the hospital for my human development students.
So your students are really getting so much exposure, and those participating in the club is pretty much the participation in the club. Are most of those psychology majors, or is it open to anybody?
It's open to anybody. We've got nursing majors, we've got business majors.
Okay, and this semester, when and where do they meet?
So we meet on the second and fourth Wednesday in 313.
Okay.
We also meet through Zoom.
Okay, so Cartersville campus or Zoom. So if you were interested and a student here at Georgia Highlands, please definitely check out what they have happening in the psychology club. So much, Elizabeth, that you do, and I'm so proud to call you friend and colleague. In addition to some of the things that you do in the classroom and some of the things that you've talked about that you do on campus, are there things in your community that you enjoy doing as well?
I am. So I'm part of the Red Cross Disaster Action Team, DAT. So for trauma cases, I'm brought out to work with the families who have lost their home to fire or flood. I also work on a trauma team for K-12 schools in Pickens County. And like I said, I'm called in for Pickens County, Cherokee County law enforcement when they have a suspect who's
and that can come at any time,
in
right?
a dangerous site. Yes, very much so.
And so how do you get to balance that with being in the classroom and also virtually? Is it something that's easy to handle, or do you find yourself, a little harried sometimes trying to balance?
It's a little hairy sometimes. I think the one benefit are my children are older, so when I go home, it gives me something else to stay busy with and enjoy.
I just love that you bring so much to the classroom. It's one of the things I've admired about you since I first met you a little over a decade ago. I do want to dovetail and talk a little bit more about what we do at Georgia Highlands. As you mentioned, you're 10 years. I can't believe that I'm about to hit 20 in August. And so both of us will be getting awards for these milestones. What would you say the Elizabeth was 10 years ago versus the Elizabeth today?
That's such a good question. I don't know that I've changed I don't know. The same passion stands true. I'm excited every time I walk into the classroom or log on and meet with students. I don't think that's dissipated at all. Life experiences, of course, have brought new examples in class, and I've become more involved in the community. But I think the stability is key.
Well, and we both love our jobs. We love particularly where we teach and the influence we get to have on our students. What would you say to a student who was thinking about being a psychology major and they were just like, but I don't know what I'm going to do with it?
Yes.
How would you help counsel them or give them some ideas of what they could do?
That's a good question. So psychology is an applied science in the same way that we see with business. So we don't go online and find psychology jobs any more than business jobs. So it's how we apply it. So one of the things that I'll tell my students is to get your feet wet, you know, maybe, get into a counseling office or go into education or go into, even law enforcement and just kind of dabble. We really don't know until we're in our job that doesn't feel like work. And I always say that if you love what you do, the money will come. Because I'll hear that quite often if there's, no money in psychology, no jobs that there's so many opportunities.
You just have to find that niche and utilize those resources. I find it interesting too, some of the things that we see, particularly with the new podcasts that are out. I certainly am obsessed with shows like Dateline. It almost seems like these real life murder mysteries and past murder mysteries have really come more to the forefront.
Very much
What are your thoughts on that?
Very much so. Very much so. Number one, we always see careers line with what we see in the media. So I remember 10, 15 years ago when LA law was popular, everybody wanted to be an attorney. So now we see a lot of individuals gearing in towards forensics. I think, I don't watch a lot of the shows just because I don't want my memory swayed by what I observe. But I think, it's bringing some interesting light to the criminal justice and psychology.
Absolutely. And I'm seeing it even with my own students when they're giving presentations. They want to talk about these serial killers whose profiles have been on these Netflix shows or the podcast or the channels dedicated to talking about these real life cases. So it is really interesting to see a resurgence to some degree in the interest in that. Would you say, and I know we might have to carry this conversation over after we come back from break, would you say the population today is easier or harder to understand?
So general population or student population?
I would say general population.
I think there's more complexities. I think there's far more trauma. I think there's far less spirituality, and I think across the board, we're just having a really hard time understanding human behavior because there's less emotion, and it could be because of technology as well. But I think there's less emotional expression.
Is there a way that we resolve that? I know you and I in the classroom do our own individual things, but as a society, how do we improve? Because we know the technology, social media, those types of elements aren't going anywhere.
Yes.
But how do we prepare our students or at least ensure that they can monitor their own physical, social health?
That's a good question. I really think it starts with K-12 and instituting meditation or a mindfulness or, kind of a peer mentoring program with the kids, something to build on emotion and connection and trust, because I think that's sadly lost.
What about parental elements? Do you feel like that's a factor at all?
I do. And
do you feel like parents are ill-prepared or ill-equipped to maybe deal with some of the mental and social disorders that our teenagers and children are facing?
I definitely think that's part of it. I would love to see all parents go through a human development course, but we've seen parents at the park who are more engaged in their phone and devices than they are in connecting with their children. And I think that's all going to play a huge role in our children's ability to, develop empathy and connections. And of course, it's going to filtrate through college classes.
Well, this is an intriguing conversation, and I would like for you to come back and hear more with Miss Elizabeth Dose.
Most affordable bachelor's degree in Northwest Georgia is right here at Georgia Highlands College. High quality and career focused. That's what you can expect at GHC. Apply today at highlands.edu.
Welcome back to the GHC Faculty Lounge. I'm Therese Baldwin-Obas, and I'm here again with Miss Elizabeth Dose. And we want to talk a little bit now about her personal life. So we talked a lot about what she does in the academic element in space, also some of the things she does outside in the creative space. So talk to us a little bit about your passions. What do you do in your spare time?
Thank you. Well, I always say I work to travel, and it's always been my goal to show the kids the world. So we've probably seen 25, 30 countries in that time.
Wow.
We go to Europe at least once or twice a year. So
I love that.
we travel. Other than that, we hike. Dennis and I hike. So we've done about close to 1,000 miles in the Appalachian, and we, just any time we can get out and get our feet in the ground and
what an experience for your kids. How many kids do you have?
So just two. Lauren, she's just graduating from Reinhardt, and Colin's a student at GHC.
Yay, wonderful. And I'm sure they will follow in both mom and dad's footsteps.
I hope so.
Definitely.
Thank you.
So you said you mentioned that you've traveled quite a bit. Has there been a favorite country that you visited?
I love the beach. I love the mountains. So Switzerland, Norway have been lovely. They've been lovely hiking places, and of course anything tropical.
Okay. So what's left on the bucket list?
That's a good question. It's a good question. I think there's more to see. I think ideally what I would like to do at some point is go and interview families and their parenting style and do some writing, because I think here in the West we tend to be so myopic, and I would love to hear or learn more about some of the other cultures and in terms of how they parent and their relationships.
And that's interesting that you say that, because we alluded to it a little bit in our earlier conversation, how sometimes the mental health and some of the social issues that our young teens are going through show up in the classroom. And what would be some things that you think, if you're a new parent or you're the parent of a teenager and maybe you're struggling, is there any advice or tips that you could give them?
So with children, I always say the problem really starts with us. So we've got to change ourselves first. I think creating more balance, tapping into our emotions, and I think I think one of the things that we forget about our kids is they never stop needing touch, hugs, and affection, and regardless of age, they need that. So I think it's so many of our kids are lonely. Our students are lonely.
I remember reading, it was probably maybe April or May of 2020, there was a company that would let you buy hugs, essentially, and they were looking for people to actually do that. And if you think about it, even though at first it's a little jarring, but you think about it, if somebody is sequestered in their own home, they live alone, or they're not near family, they are missing that. Yes. One of the concepts we study in communication is the study of haptics, which is touch, and we talk about how some things can change in a conversation just with a simple motion. One of the things I mentioned to our students is that generally that arm area is a really sensitive spot. And so what research has shown is that if you want to get something from someone, if you touch kind of that back part of the arm, that they're more likely to comply. And so I encourage my students to test it out, and then they come back to class and report their findings. And I would say probably a good 70 or so percent say that it has worked.
That's so interesting. So we've got a nerve between our wrist and our elbow, and a lot of times when students are nervous, they'll end up kind of massaging this area, but apparently it's connected to our limbic system. So if it's a self-soother. So that's very interesting about the shoulder as well as the
And that's good information to know as well. So you said starting with themselves, then making sure they apply some of these concepts. Would you say the modern parent allows their child to be emotionally driven, or do you still think there's a bit of a disconnect with being able to showcase your emotion, or do you just hold it all inside?
I think the old adage that children are meant to be seen and not heard still stands true, sadly enough.
Yes.
And I think I'm seeing more parents come into my practice with emotional issues, depression, anxiety, trauma, and I realize quite quickly if they haven't resolved their emotions, it's going to be filtrated.
Right.
I will tell you, Therese, that one thing that really interests me about psychology is secondhand, even third-hand trauma, in terms of how our great grandparents have carried that through genetically, and how we're still expressing those symptoms today. So I think, they're kids through observation, but also in carrying the
Absolutely.
genome for that.
And I like what you said about children being seen, not heard. That is one of the very first activities I do with my public speaking class, because I have been able to derive connections with how students are comfortable on stage presenting, what type of topics they feel are taboo or things that you should never discuss. And a lot of that is based on what they were taught in their childhood. And what I have found that students who grew up in more collectivist cultures or cultures where they talked about a lot of things, they seem a little bit more forward thinking in their approach to those topics, versus if they grew up in a home that was very much mandated that it's my way or the highway, they are very submersed as far as their opinions are concerned. And that's one of the things I try to help educate them on, is that it's important to have a voice.
Yes.
And once they find that voice, what do you do about it? How do you help others? How do you help your community by sharing your voice? Because I don't think we learn and grow as a society if we keep everything to ourselves or only align ourselves with individuals who think, look, do things exactly the way that we do them. So I love the fact that you're also interested in that aspect as well. What are some of the biggest challenges you would say? You mentioned, of course, not having emotional needs met. You mentioned spirituality being lacking as far as the household is concerned. Is there anything else that you think is contributing to our students?
I don't know about contributing, but I will say this, that years ago we saw 1 out of every 50 school-age children on the autism spectrum, and now it's 1 out of every 33. Wow. So I think as educators and in the classroom as peers, it's understanding that there's a broad spectrum, very, very neurodiverse, and understanding that not all of the kids present with the same type of emotionality or ability to learn the same way.
So how do we as teachers modify that? Because many of us do teach larger lecture sections, and sometimes it's difficult to be able to make sure that we're meeting the needs of each of our different students.
It's to kind of condense that into a response, I think it's really a matter of tuning into the students that seem a little bit more quiet, withdrawn, less expressive, maybe approaching them after class, giving them a lot of social
that one-on-one contact.
Yes, and maybe working with them in a different way where it's not necessarily in a group or something to their comfortability. One of the things I've realized, there are some students don't understand sarcasm, or they don't understand jokes in a different way.
Right.
So it's really a matter of understanding the emotional dialect there.
And I would say I definitely concur with that. I've noticed that even in the way that I structure speeches, I've noticed a shift in the types of topics that students want to talk about. For example, this week my students are finishing up debate presentations where they are paired with another person in the class, and they have to choose a highly charged, highly controversial topic. I do ask them to determine who's going to argue for or support of the topic and who's going to argue against. And generally I indicate that it's a lot easier to argue actually a position that you don't believe, believe it or not, because it forces you to do the research and look at a perspective from a different lens. And I will say that 9 times out of 10 students say that ends up being their favorite speech of the semester.
I love that. Empathy. Empathy
exactly.
is broad spectrum.
Because if you don't have the opportunities to do that, and I'm not saying that all of them choose to, some of them want to argue the point of view that they want to, and that sometimes does happen, but generally they learn from that. They learn from that experience that, oh, I heard a different perspective, I respect this opinion. It may not change how I feel, but at least I had the opportunity to hear it. Because that civility from discourse, I feel like, is missing. And maybe it is tied to these emotional elements that you and I have been discussing, is that if there's not that being taught in the home, that structure is not there, you are just really kind of free falling and learning for yourself, which may not be the best way. And the other thing I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, because you obviously analyzed the mind, the body, and the spirit. Do all 3 need to be in alignment, in your opinion, or do you feel like we need to maybe be in touch with one over the other?
I think they all align. In fact, when we talk about relationships, I think having those 3 aligned are central to the longevity of the relationship, or friendship, or job.
You of course look at it from the lens of structure of the behavior. Whereas a lot of times I'm looking at it from the lens of how it's delivered and how it's perceived in front of a boardroom, or that dynamic that you create with your boss or supervisor. One of the things I'm starting to hear more and more from my students is that they're anxious, which adrenaline is one thing, but it has gone past the level of just I'm nervous to almost like in tears before a presentation because they're so anxious about not getting anything incorrect, about their peers and how they'll receive it. How do I effectively communicate with that student that it's okay to have fears? It's okay to also want to do well on an assignment, that it's also okay to want your peers to appreciate what you have to say, but at the same time not make that the goal.
Yes,
Does that make sense?
That's a really good question. Number one, I always say this, neurologically, fear and excitement are processed the same way in the brain. So you're not fearful, you're just excited. So kind of transfer that mindset. And I don't know if this will help, and I'm sure this is something you profess, but it's really a matter of practice without the notes, rehearsal to the point where it's second nature and comfortable. It's a tough, I think sensitivity to rejection is so deeply ingrained in our students today. And I just think, making sure that they know that they're loved and lovable and okay and accepted regardless
who
of
they
their
are.
grade. Yes. Yeah.
And you and I both have open door policies, I know, both in our classrooms, but also in our offices. And many of our students who are struggling open up to us prior to even opening up to friends and family members. And I feel such an honor that they do that, knowing that we are there for them and we're there to support them. As we kind of wrap our conversation up, I'm interested in knowing, you mentioned that at the end of your career, you would hope to go around and talk to parents, possibly write a book. What would that title be called, do you think? If you could give it a name.
That's a good question. Years ago, I worked at a foster care unit, and it was titled Inasmuch. And that's always resonated with me because inasmuch to me means whatever we're capable of creating. So in the process of creating. So inasmuch.
I love that. Perfect answer.
Thank you.
How would you describe yourself? And you can use as many words as you would like. 1, 3, 5. How would you describe yourself?
I think, sometimes it's easier to look at what we look at in others and what we approve of or applaud in others. So I think conscientiousness is one. I think competent and maybe loyal.
I would also add empathetic
Empathetic.
to that
Thank you.
list because
Thank
that's
you.
one of the things that first catches people about you. And then effervescent. I'll give you 5.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate you.
So as we kind of wrap up our show here today, there are some things that we've talked about, of course, that have been very deep in nature, but I want you to leave giving our audience something that they can take home. So what's one final piece of advice that you would give to anybody out there watching?
I would say find a why, find your passion, live with your passion every day, ask yourself better questions.
Love that.
What is great about today? What do I love about this person? What do I love about being a student or professor?
Yeah. And continuously improve, right?
Yeah.
Don't be
Very much
afraid
so.
of that change. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, and I appreciate you watching us this afternoon. Again, this was Professor Elizabeth Dose. I'm Therese Baldwin-Obas, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.